Paul. That was really nice. It is so great to be here with you tonight. It's my honor to have been invited to this august assembly of fellow admirers of our 16th president. And what a better place to be than right here tonight with this remarkable legacy that we all share. I'm going to do two things with you tonight. The first will be, but the main thing I want to show you is my pictures. And I have a slideshow presentation for you, a PowerPoint that I'm going to go through after I give some introductory words. So there's two parts to this. And then I believe if there's time, we can do a little bit of back and forth, and you can ask me any questions, and we have time for that as well, I believe. But I thought that I would begin tonight, and I don't do this very often, but I was wondering what I should talk to you about tonight. And I thought, people have been asking me, H over there asked me tonight, where do these pictures come from that you guys have? And I thought I would tell you a kind of family story, how we got involved with the collecting of Lincoln portraits and the photographs of the 19th century. And it's a long story, but I'm going to try to make it interesting and give you the major outlines of it. It all goes back to my great-grandfather, a man named Frederick Hill Meserve, who was born in the year 1865, the year Lincoln was killed, and who lived to a grand old age of 96, dying in 1962. As a young boy, I knew him. I was 11 when he died, and I can recall numerous visits to his home in New York City. He lived in a 5-story brownstone house, and my father often took my brother Peter and me there to see him, to visit this old man that we called Gampy. We loved, I can remember the center staircase wending its way up the 5 stories to the top floor where he kept his great collection. We loved going up there. You could look down all the way to the basement, and my brother and I would have fun with that staircase. But the main thing was to go into the inner sanctum on the top floor where Gampy kept his treasures. And I can still remember the scene of it, the smell of it, the old leather and dust of the books, the sight of the statuary, and the cabinets filled with interesting things. It was just a little world unto itself. And there in the midst of it, sitting at his desk, this old man with no hair, kind of brown spots on the top of his head, but his eyes twinkling. He loved my father, and he loved whenever we came to visit him. He was so kind to us and would take us around and show us what he had. My father, let me mention him because he is my greatest friend and partner. We worked together for many years. I wish he were here with us tonight. He died 4 years ago. But he grew up in Morristown, New Jersey. I was invited to speak there a few weeks ago, and it was amazing to go back to his hometown. We had a party at the house in which he grew up before I then addressed a couple hundred people that had gathered there and remembered our family well. His mother was a noted children's book author. Some of you may recognize the name of Dorothy Kunhardt, the author of Pat the Bunny, among other works. But she was, as well as being a children's book author, she was an historian, and early on became an assistant to her father. They were very, very close, Gampy and my grandmother. And in the 1940s, she decided to join him in his work. And by the late 50s and 60s, when I used to visit them in Morristown regularly as a boy, she had all but taken over for him. She was really writing many of his speeches. She was conducting her own research at that point, and she was publishing articles in places like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine. And ultimately, her masterpiece, a book she wrote, she co-authored with my father, called 20 Days. Some of you may remember this book. It was the definitive account of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the 20-day funeral, or the week-long funeral that ensued as his body was taken back to Springfield, Illinois, stopping off in city after city so that millions of Americans could actually pay tribute to him as he moved west. This book was published just 3 years after my great-grandfather's death. Let me tell you a little bit about my family's house in Morristown. It was a large clapboard structure. They rented from a family called the Jenks. And it was a very wealthy family that owned 1,000 acres on the top of what was called Mount Kemble. And it included a large part of George Washington's winter headquarters in New Jersey. And today it's owned by the National Park Service. My father used to tell us stories about growing up there as a boy. They would often find Revolutionary War bullets in the woods. So this is where he grew up. And there was an unspoken agreement between my grandparents that he would be in charge of the outdoors, the grounds and the gardens. He was a wonderful gardener. And she would be in charge of the indoors. But this was not because of her domesticity or her interior decorating skills. In fact, she was a pack rabbit. The whole house was an office, really, for her. She had an arrangement with a local bookseller named Mr. Turret's, and day after day she would go into town and come back with bagfuls of books. And her appetite for them became insatiable. In a single purchase from New York City, a collector, she acquired 800 volumes that had once belonged to close relatives of Mary Lincoln. Each project she worked on demanded new sprees of book buying. Once, while working on a magazine article on Lincoln's dog, Fido, she filled 2 whole rooms with volumes of research and still found herself craving more space. "Dad says it is dope," she wrote to my father, "and I am its helpless, pathetic victim." By the time I remember visiting in the late 50s, you could barely walk through any of the rooms. There were so many piles of books everywhere. Books lined the staircases all the way up to the attic, so there's only a thin little passageway available. And the attic, once you got there, was absolutely chock-a-block. Many of these volumes, of course, came down through my grandmother to my father and ultimately to my brother and me. And they became, it turned out, that I had the opportunity to use them in the 3-year period in which I researched and wrote Looking for Lincoln, which is one of the books that we have here tonight. That library was an absolutely essential part of the research. But it was my great-grandfather's photographic collection that was his triumph and his greatest legacy. His passion for collecting was first kindled back in the late 19th century when his father, William Neal Meserve, asked him to illustrate his Civil War memoirs. Major Meserve had fought in the Union Army. He'd been wounded at the Battle of Antietam. He'd served under Ulysses S. Grant in the Wilderness Campaign. And at the end of the war, he'd been stationed in Washington, just outside of Washington, D.C., as the commander of his own battalion. And he was there on the night of April 14th, on the night of Lincoln's murder, that he was ordered by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to help cordon off the city in search of the assassins. Well, in the early 1890s, using his field notes and his diary taken from that period, William Neal Meserve wrote a detailed memoir of his life in the Army. And then he asked his son, my great-grandfather Frederick, to help him find illustrations for it. And that's why Gampy began, and that's how he began his search for photographs, first of all the battlefields his father had fought on, and of all the officers he had fought alongside. So at the age of 31, in 1897, he made his first great purchase at Bang's Auction House on Lower Fifth Avenue in New York City. He was at this auction, sight unseen, he bid on a package of old photographs, which he then took home to open. That night, he later recalled, I had my first experience of the sensation of intoxication. That intoxication, the only kind I've ever experienced, that comes from the possession of a rare find. What he had found, what he had bought, was more than 100 salt prints in exquisite condition, photographs of leading figures from the 19th century. President James Buchanan, Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney, Senator John Crittenden, Mormon leader Brigham Young, New York Governor William Seward, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Robert E. Lee, dozens and dozens of eminent figures of the 19th century have been photographed at places like Matthew Brady's studio in New York City. They were soft, brown in color, and unglazed, he recalled, with a clarity and beauty so evident that I was stirred. After that, I attended auction after auction. He said, my appetite had been whetted. What had begun was a quest that took him from secondhand bookstores and print shops to auction houses and newspaper morgues to 100 curious places to acquire the photographs that as yet others were not collecting. He became fascinated with photography, eventually dedicating himself to becoming an expert in the field. Then, in 1902, came the turning point in his life. He had heard that a huge portion of Matthew Brady's famous collection of 19th century negatives had been transferred in lieu of debt to his former printer, Ian H.T. Anthony, who had now formed another company known as the Anthony Scoville Company, or ANSCO. I don't know if any of you have heard of ANSCO. When I was a boy, you could get an ANSCO developing kit. They were kind of a competitor of Kodak, and they still were in the photographic business. But ANSCO had located its headquarters near Hoboken, New Jersey. And my great-grandfather sniffed his way like a detective, and he found out that those missing negatives of Matthew Brady were still in existence. They were stored away in one of the warehouses of the ANSCO company. He got permission to go in and see, and he found them. There they were, lying in great piles, covered with grit and grime, had been forgotten for decades and decades. And he began to lift them up and look them at the light. And he realized what he was looking at. One of the images he picked up was a life image of Abraham Lincoln from 1864. It disappeared. It was unknown. There it was. He bought the entire load, 15,000 glass negatives, for a sum he never revealed. And then it took 2 large trucks to cart them back to his house in New York City. His wife was furious. But he moved them in, and then he proceeded to spend the next many, many decades of his long life studying and organizing and cleaning and becoming the expert of these images. They became the centerpiece of what became known as the Meserve collection. Well, I could go on and on, but this was just the beginning. Another great day, he acquired 3,000 prints from the War College in Washington. In 1912, he persuaded this college to allow him to copy 350 of its daguerreotypes, many of which were then lost to history. His copy images became the only record that existed. Hardly a day went by without a new acquisition.